The hallway candle still flickered low when my daughter-in-law leaned close and whispered, "We only invited you out of pity, so don't stay long." Still gripping the wine bottle I'd brought, I steadied it on the counter like it was fine china. As the vanilla scent thickened in the air, so did the silence that followed her words. While they moved on to fake laughter and forced cheer, I studied the flame, small but steady. The same warmth they pretended to offer was something I'd built without them for years. That's when I smiled, because pity fades but property titles don't. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The December air in Charlotte carried a crisp bite, the kind that slid under collars and made streetlights glow sharper in the dark. Nancy stepped carefully onto the sidewalk outside the uptown restaurant, leaning slightly on the cane she still used on colder days. The valet canopy shimmered with gold lights, and through the tall windows she could see guests sipping wine that cost more than her monthly utilities. She hadn't wanted to be here, but Jason had insisted over the phone, his voice polite, thin, almost rehearsed. "Mom, Claire wants you there." Nancy didn't believe it for a second. Still, she came. She always came when her son asked, long after it stopped feeling like an invitation and more like a quiet obligation stitched into her ribs. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with soft jazz and clinking crystal. The maitre d' led her to a corner booth where Jason and Claire sat opposite each other, the low amber light catching the gleam of Claire's necklace. Claire didn't stand. She offered a smile that never touched her eyes, more temperature than expression. "You made it," Jason said, sliding out of the booth to help her sit. He looked tired around the edges, like someone constantly smoothing over cracks no one else wanted to see. Nancy forced a small, warm smile. "I did, thank you for inviting me." The menus arrived, embossed and heavy. Claire chatted about a fundraiser she was basically running by herself, though Nancy knew the woman hadn't lifted anything heavier than a wine glass in months. Jason nodded dutifully, adding polite affirmations between sips of his drink. Halfway through the appetizers, Claire leaned across the table, her perfume drifting like cold flowers. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, almost. "We only invited you out of pity," she whispered. "Don't stay long." The sentence landed with the precision of a well-placed blade, quiet, efficient, cruel. Nancy blinked once, then she smiled. Not forced, not bitter, just small and deliberate, the kind that came from a lifetime of learning how to hide disappointment as easily as receipts. "I appreciate the honesty," she murmured. Claire leaned back, expression smooth as glass, already lifting her wine to her lips as if the moment had never happened. Jason didn't notice, he rarely did. Dinner carried on with forced pleasantries and the kind of laughter that cracked at the edges. Nancy ate slowly, carefully, taking tiny bites while watching Claire maintain her flawless facade, complimenting the server, pretending warmth for the table adjacent, glancing at her reflection in the window more than at her own family. It was a performance Claire had perfected, and Nancy, after years under her roof, knew every line. Toward the end of the meal, Sadie slipped into the booth beside her parents, backpack still slung over one shoulder. She looked exhausted in the way only teenagers forced into adult dinner reservations could. "Hi, Grandma," she said softly, sliding in next to Nancy. Claire shot her a look. "We talked about this, you're late." Sadie ignored her. Instead, she nudged Nancy's elbow and pressed a folded slip of notebook paper into her palm without looking directly at her. It was small, crumpled, a little smudged with pencil. Nancy unfolded it under the table. "I hate how they treat you." The words were jagged, slanted, written in haste, written with feeling. Nancy swallowed hard. The room dimmed around the edges, the noise of plates and silverware fading beneath the thud of her own heartbeat. She looked at Sadie, who was staring straight ahead, jaw tight, pretending nothing had happened. Nancy slipped the note into her purse, her fingers steady. When the check arrived, Claire thanked the server sweetly, her voice dipped in honey, her smile engineered for witnesses. Nancy only watched her. And she thought, not painfully but clearly, "This is the last time I let them seat me at this table." The next morning, Charlotte's chill seeped through Nancy's coat as she pushed open the door of a small diner tucked between a laundromat and a shoe repair shop. Bells jingled overhead. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee wrapped around her like a blanket she hadn't known she needed. Marla was already in their usual booth, hair clipped back, reading the paper with the same intensity she once reserved for cross-examining hostile witnesses. She lowered it the moment she saw Nancy. "You look like hell's quieter cousin," Marla said, sliding a mug toward the empty spot. Nancy sat carefully, her hips still stiff, the night before replaying like a low hum behind her eyes. She took a sip of the coffee, letting the warmth settle before speaking. "She leaned in," Nancy began, "right across the table, and she said." Nancy paused, voice flattening into precision. We only invited you out of pity, don't stay long. Marla froze mid-reach for the sugar, her jaw set. She said it exactly like that. Word for word. A slow, dangerous smile curled at the corner of Marla's mouth, one Nancy recognized from decades ago, a smile that always meant someone had made a very unwise mistake. You kept the receipt, right? Nancy blinked at her. For the dinner. For the dinner, Marla confirmed, stirring her coffee with a calm that contradicted the fire in her eyes. People like Claire forget what they say 5 minutes after they say it. People like you, she tapped the side of Nancy's mug, write it down. Nancy gave a small nod. She had written it down in her planner, along with the exact time, the table number, and the way Claire's perfume smelled like frozen roses, not out of spite, just out of habit. She'd spent 40 years in accounting. Details were her first language. Marla leaned in. So what now? Nancy inhaled slowly. I called Carmen. Marla's eyebrows shot up, impressed. Carmen Lowe, the estate specialist. Yes. Good, Marla said, sitting back like a judge satisfied with a verdict. Claire wanted to make you feel small. Carmen will make you untouchable. The waitress arrived with plates, eggs for Marla, oatmeal, and fruit for Nancy. Nancy barely touched her spoon. I need updates, Nancy said quietly. Real ones, my will, property titles, everything with my accounts, it's been years. Marla took a bite of toast, chewed, swallowed, then pointed the knife at her like they were in court again. Claire thinks you're harmless, she said. Jason pretends he doesn't hear her. Sadie, that girl sees everything, but Claire, she underestimates you most of all. Nancy stirred her oatmeal. I don't want revenge. That's because you're not vindictive, Marla replied, but what you are, prepared. Nancy's phone buzzed, a message from Carmen. Call me this afternoon. I reviewed the files, we'll fix everything. Marla watched Nancy's expression shift, subtle but sure. You're ready, Marla said. Nancy nodded once. I am. They finished breakfast in easy silence, both women wrapped in the kind of companionship built on decades, not hours. Outside, the sky brightened, the sun stretching across the sidewalk as if encouraging Nancy forward. When they stood to leave, Marla squeezed her hand. The cruel forget, she said softly. You write things down. Nancy stepped outside, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. Her breath formed thin clouds in the air. Her phone buzzed again, another message, this one from Jason. Mom, Claire said you left early last night. Everything okay? Nancy didn't answer. Because behind Jason's text, a new notification appeared. Carmen Lowe, before we talk, there's something you should see. It concerns Claire. Nancy sat at her kitchen table with a fresh cup of tea and the PDF Carmen had sent glowing on her laptop screen. The account access attempt was timestamped at 11:42 p.m. Claire's hour, when she paced the house in silk robes, scrolling for envy and opportunities. Nancy didn't feel anger, she felt confirmation. She opened the banking portal she had used with almost ritual precision for 4 decades. 2 clicks brought up the row of automatic transfers, one of which she had quietly set years ago to help Jason and Claire with the mortgage, just until they were settled. They had never acknowledged it, not once. Nancy highlighted the line item, took a slow breath, and selected Cancel Transfer. A pop-up window asked, Are you sure? Nancy clicked yes without hesitation. The screen blinked, the line disappeared. A weight she hadn't noticed loosened from her shoulders. She sat back, hands folded in her lap, listening to the soft hum of her refrigerator, the steady tick of the clock on the wall. Silence wasn't empty, not anymore. It felt like space she'd finally reclaimed. At exactly 9:18 a.m., her phone vibrated. Jason, hey, the house payment bounced. The message was short, almost sheepish, as if he were tiptoeing around a landmine Claire had planted. Nancy typed slowly, deliberately, making sure each word landed as cleanly as Claire's insult the night before. Nancy, talk to your wife. She didn't add anything else, she didn't cushion, she didn't explain. She hit send and placed the phone face down on the table, letting the small surge of adrenaline wash over her. 5 minutes later, the phone rang. Claire. Nancy let it buzz twice before answering. She wanted Claire to hear the quiet in her voice, the kind that made people lean forward even when no threat was spoken. Nancy, Claire cooed, her tone dipped in that faux concern she used with social acquaintances she was secretly competing against. Sweetheart, I noticed something odd with our mortgage payment. Everything okay on your end? Nancy studied a dust mote floating in a beam of winter light. Perfectly fine. Well, Claire continued, the sweetness thickening, the auto transfer didn't go through. I'm sure it's just a glitch or one of those silly bank things. It wasn't a glitch. Claire paused. Oh. I stopped paying it, Nancy said calmly. After all, I wouldn't want you mistaking financial support for pity. There was a sharp inhale on the other end, a split second where Claire's composure cracked like a hairline fracture in porcelain. Nancy, she said, voice tightening underneath the syrup, I didn't mean what you think I meant last night. You meant exactly what you said. Nancy's tone remained even unshaken, and pity shouldn't come with perks. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Nancy imagined Claire's face. The pinch between her brows, the widening of her eyes, the frantic calculations as she replayed her own cruelty and realized it was now costing her actual money. Claire finally exhaled, strained and uneven. We'll talk about this later. No, Nancy corrected gently, you will, I've already moved on. She ended the call before Claire could respond. Nancy sat still for a moment, feeling the shift inside herself, subtle but seismic. The kind that signaled the start of an entirely new chapter, not born out of retaliation but out of boundary. Her phone buzzed again, another message from Jason. Jason, can we please sort this out? Claire is upset. Nancy shook her head softly, almost pitying him. Then she sent the only reply she owed him. Nancy, that sounds like a problem you two can solve together. She closed her laptop, grabbed her coat, and stepped out into the cold morning air. She was due to meet Carmen downtown, and the thought gave her a quiet thrill, a glimpse of the next version of her life taking shape. As she walked toward her car, her phone buzzed one more time. Not Jason. Not Claire. Sadie, Grandma, something weird is going on here. Can I talk to you later, privately? Nancy waited until the house emptied. Jason's car pulled out first, his usual slow reverse, a cautious pause at the end of the driveway. Claire followed minutes later, tires crunching over the frosted pavement, Bluetooth already engaged as she launched into the kind of brisk morning chatter she saved for the women she wanted to impress. Silence settled behind them, thick and liberating. Nancy stood in the middle of the guest room, the space they'd offered her after her hip surgery, the space Claire always called temporary, even when Nancy did the laundry, cooked dinner twice a week, and paid part of the mortgage they never acknowledged. The small collection of her belongings fit neatly into two medium boxes and a carry-on. A life condensed to essentials, clothes, a few framed photos, her planner, the sweater Sadie bought her last Christmas with her own allowance. She taped the last box shut, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet room. It felt like sealing an era. Downstairs, the kitchen gleamed in its staged, magazine-ready perfection. Nancy placed her house key on the counter, right beside the bowl Claire used for decorative lemons. Next to the key, she set a single sheet of paper. Her handwriting was steady, almost elegant. Exit achieved, good luck. No emotion. No apology. No explanations. She didn't owe anyone clarification for leaving a place where she'd been tolerated instead of valued. Nancy took one last slow breath, exhaled, and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. Her hip twinged slightly as she eased her boxes into the trunk of her car, but the ache only sharpened her resolve. She wasn't running. She was reclaiming. Halfway down the street, her phone buzzed. Sadie, are you okay? Nancy smiled at the screen, surprised by how much warmth those three words carried. Sadie wasn't probing. She wasn't fishing for sides. She was checking on her grandmother, the only person in that house who ever did. Nancy typed carefully. Nancy, more than okay, I'm moving forward. Three dots pulsed, then disappeared. Sadie was thinking, choosing her words. Before anything came through, Nancy tucked the phone into her coat and pulled onto the main road. Her new temporary rental, a small, sunlit unit in a quiet retirement villa, sat nestled behind tall pines and trimmed hedges. It wasn't grand, it wasn't modern, but it was hers. No critiques about her decor. No sideways glances at her walker, no sighs when she moved too slowly down the stairs. Just peace. She set the boxes inside the door and opened her laptop at the kitchen counter. Time to sever the invisible threads Claire still assumed she could tug. Mail forwarding first. She said. Completed the form online, redirecting everything to the new address. Bills, bank statements, medical reminders, nothing would pass through Claire's house again. Next, passwords. She changed them all: banking, utilities she'd been paying under their roof, her email, even the streaming services Claire used without asking. Carmen had advised it, but Nancy did it with a calm satisfaction that felt almost medicinal. Each change was a door closed. Each update a boundary drawn. Her phone chimed, a notification from a social app she rarely opened. A photo Claire had posted, brunch with her friends at some rooftop restaurant. Claire's caption shone with performative relief. Finally have our space back. Nancy didn't react, didn't tighten her jaw, didn't roll her eyes. Instead, she whispered good and closed the app. The truth was simple. People who celebrated your absence never deserved your presence. She moved to the living room and opened the blinds. Golden late afternoon light spilled across the carpet. It was quiet here, honest quiet, not the strained kind she'd lived in for months. Her phone buzzed again. Sadie. This time, a longer message. Dad and Claire are freaking out. They said you snuck out. They're blaming me now. I didn't say anything. But Grandma, you didn't see the way Claire reacted. It's worse than normal. Nancy felt the faintest prickle of concern, not fear but recognition. Something was unraveling in that house. And she had pulled only one thread. She typed, "I'm safe, tell me more." 3 dots appeared, then vanished, returned. And finally, Claire said she's calling a lawyer. Downtown Charlotte glimmered with sharp winter sunlight as Nancy crossed the plaza toward Carmen Lowe's building, an expanse of glass and steel that reflected the city like a polished blade. The revolving doors exhaled warm air perfumed with citrus cleaner, and Nancy stepped inside with the quiet assurance of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. The elevator opened onto a sleek hallway with soft gray carpeting and framed prints of Carolina landscapes. Carmen's name was etched on a frosted glass panel at the end, her office perched high enough to overlook the skyline. Carmen herself stood when Nancy entered, her dark hair pinned neatly, her expression both calm and sharpened with purpose. "Ready?" she asked. Nancy hung her coat on the rack, smoothing the cuff. "More than ready." Carmen gestured her toward a large mahogany table with a stack of documents arranged in precise order. Estate files, trust forms, updated titles, the beginnings of a plan Nancy had only dared imagine until now. "Before we start," Carmen said, sliding over a printed sheet, "you need to see this." It was an email thread, Claire's name highlighted in bold. Time-stamped, petty, entitled, a request to inquire about Nancy's accounts, framed as family necessity. Nancy skimmed it only once before setting it aside, her pulse steady. "That confirms everything." "It does," Carmen agreed, "which means we're not updating your estate, we're rebuilding it." Nancy folded her hands neatly, her posture composed. "Let's begin." Carmen opened the first folder. Major change 1, Jason and Claire are removed entirely. Not reduced, not minimized, removed. An odd, gentle ache settled beneath Nancy's ribs, not grief but the ghost of it. She nodded once. "Proceed." Carmen signed her witness line, then rotated the folder to Nancy. "Next, I've drafted a no-contest clause. If either of them challenges anything, they lose everything, even sentimental inheritance." Nancy allowed herself a small, dry smile. "They won't like that." "They don't need to," Carmen replied. "They only need to accept it." Nancy signed again, her pen strokes crisp, precise. The next folder was labeled Beneficiary Designation, Sadie Rowlands. A warmth bloomed in Nancy's chest. "She gets it all?" Nancy asked softly. "She does," Carmen confirmed. "Under an age-conditional trust. Full access at 25, partial before then, overseen by a trustee you choose." Nancy ran her fingertip along the edge of the page. "She's the only one who ever saw me, not the role, me." Carmen's voice softened. "Then she's the right choice." Nancy signed without hesitation. Carmen reached for another set of forms. "This is your medical power of attorney." Nancy smiled before Carmen even finished the sentence. "Marla." "That's what I assumed." Carmen slid the papers forward. "You trust her." "With everything that matters." "Then she gets the authority," Carmen said. "Not Jason, not Claire, no one who'd put convenience before your care." Nancy signed again. The more she wrote, the lighter she felt, like each signature swept another layer of dust off her future. When Carmen gathered the completed documents, she tapped them neatly against the table. "This is airtight. There's nothing they can touch, nothing they can guilt you into reversing." Nancy exhaled, long and even. "I'm not bitter." "Carmen," she said, folding her hands, "I'm just reorganized." Carmen's answering smile was small and approving. "There's a difference, and you know exactly which side you're on." As Nancy stood to leave, her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She ignored it until she reached the lobby, where golden afternoon light spilled through the tall windows like a benediction. She checked the screen. "Not Jason. Not Claire. Sadie, Grandma, they found the note you left. Claire is losing it." Before Nancy could respond, a second message arrived, this time from an unknown number. "Ms. Rowlands, this is Officer Grady. We need to speak with you about an incident reported at your son's address. The officer's voicemail hadn't rattled Nancy the way Claire hoped it would. The mention of an incident was nothing more than noise she had prepared for, noise Carmen had anticipated. Still, she took the precaution of forwarding the voicemail straight to Carmen, who responded within minutes. Handled, don't engage, keep moving. Nancy did exactly that. By the next morning, Charlotte's sky lay low and gray, the kind of weather that made the city feel quieter than usual. Nancy brewed a pot of tea in her rental's small kitchen, her hands steady, her shoulders soft. A woman who had spent her life balancing books didn't panic at disorganized people flailing. Claire's unraveling wasn't a threat. It was a predictable equation finally catching up with itself. She had just settled at the dining table when her phone buzzed, Jason's name flashing across the screen. She let it ring twice before answering. "Mom," he said, breathless like he had jogged to pick up the phone. "Something's wrong with the joint savings account, the one you used to." "I know which account you mean," Nancy replied calmly. "Well," Jason continued, voice tightening, "Claire tried to transfer funds this morning and it bounced back. The bank said the account was locked. Why would?" "Because Carmen locked it," Nancy said, "at my request." Jason fell silent. Nancy could practically hear him shifting his weight, running a hand over the back of his neck the way he always did when reality didn't match the version Claire had promised him. "But why?" he finally asked. Nancy didn't sigh, she didn't raise her voice. She just lowered her chin, the way one does before placing a checkmate piece on the board. "Claire told me not to stay long," Nancy said, "so I left." Jason inhaled sharply. A long pause followed, so long Nancy wondered if he'd forgotten how to speak without Claire in the room. "Mom," he said slowly, she didn't, you know how she gets." "I know exactly how she gets," Nancy answered, "and I know exactly how I'm treated in that house. This isn't sudden, this is overdue." "Nancy, just can you come over? Can we talk in person?" "No," she said softly, "you should talk to your wife." She hung up before he could respond. By late afternoon, the meltdown had begun. Nancy's phone buzzed relentlessly, but not with calls. With the screenshots. "Sadie again." The first image showed Claire on her social app, hair perfectly curled despite her panic, eyes wide in a theatrical attempt at wounded dignity. "Some people forget who helped them," the caption read. "Some people take advantage of kindness." The comments section was empty. The next screenshot showed Claire pacing the living room, hands flailing mid-rant. Sadie had caught her mid-sentence, mouth twisted, eyes sharp. The caption Sadie added under the photo. "This is gold." Nancy snorted, an unrestrained, genuine laugh she hadn't felt in months. The edges of her worry softened. Sadie wasn't just watching, she was documenting. Claire might have controlled the house, but Sadie understood the truth. More screenshots came, each more dramatic. Claire clutching her forehead, Claire pointing at the ceiling, Claire telling Jason something with the fervor of a preacher summoning lightning. Then a text. "Sadie, she's telling people you abandoned responsibility. She keeps repeating it like she's on a reality show." Nancy typed. "Nancy, I didn't abandon anything. I just ended what never should have been my responsibility in the first place." Sadie sent back a laughing emoji followed by, "Wish you could see this." Nancy set her phone down and looked around her rental. The warm light, the quiet, the sense of her life finally fitting back into her own hands. She didn't miss the house. She didn't miss the tension. She didn't miss the version of herself she had to be there. Everything she had reclaimed was worth infinitely more than the money she once funneled into their mortgage. But just as she lifted her tea, her phone buzzed again, this time with a new name flashing across the screen. "Officer Grady." The message was short. "Ms. Rowlands, please call me." Claire provided additional information. Nancy's stomach didn't drop, but her jaw tightened. Officer Grady's message still sat unanswered, but Nancy refused to let Claire's latest th. Etrix poison the one thing she had been craving for months, an evening built on warmth, not tension, laughter, not obligation. So she spent the next 2 days preparing. Her rental villa wasn't large, but it had something their old house never did: sincerity. No staged floral arrangements, no curated neutral palette meant only for guests, no sense of performing for people who took more than they gave. Just a space that felt like hers. Nancy laid out the table settings, blue ceramic plates she'd purchased decades ago and kept tucked away because Claire once called them dated. A linen runner, real candles, a centerpiece of winter greenery she'd gathered from the villa's courtyard. Every piece felt intentional. By 6, the doorbell chimed. Marla stepped inside wearing a deep plum sweater and carrying a bottle of champagne wrapped like a present. This, she announced, costs more than Claire's monthly hair maintenance. I checked. Behind her came Edna from Bridge Club, Leo from her old accounting office, and two neighbors who brought homemade biscuits that smelled like butter and warmth. The energy shifted instantly, brighter, lighter, the kind of air you breathe when no one in the room is waiting to judge you. Nancy guided them in with a quiet pride she didn't bother hiding. They filled the space easily, coats tossed onto chairs, voices rising and overlapping in friendly chaos. The living room glowed under soft lamps, and the dining table looked almost festive under the candlelight. Look at this spread, Leo said, eyeing the roasted chicken, herb potatoes, and citrus salad. I'd marry you myself if you'd have me. Stand in line, Edna grumbled, elbowing him. Marla was already popping the champagne, the cork ricocheting off the ceiling with a loud crack. To new beginnings, she said, raising her glass. Nancy lifted hers too, the bubbles prickling her nose, the gold of the liquid flickering under the candle flames. To self-respect, she added, voice steady and warm. To that, Edna hollered. They toasted, 5 glasses clinking in a chorus Claire had never earned the right to hear. The room filled with laughter as stories unfolded, tales of disastrous first dates, botched holiday casseroles, misadventures during the city's last ice storm. Nancy laughed until her stomach ached, until tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, until her cheeks flushed with something she hadn't felt in years, belonging. And when Marla launched into a particularly unflattering imitation of Claire, arms crossed, eyebrows high, nose tilted like a malfunctioning elevator, the entire table dissolved into hysterics. Nancy doubled over, gripping her stomach. Marla, she wheezed between laughs, stop, you'll kill us. She'd hate that she inspired such joy, Marla replied smugly. Midway through dessert, peach cobbler warm from the oven, Nancy's phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't check it immediately. She didn't need to, tonight wasn't about obligations. But when she finally glanced down, her heart softened. Sadie, I wish I was there instead. Nancy tucked the phone closer, warmth spreading through her chest. She typed back. Nancy, come for winter break. I'll save you a seat at the table. A moment later. Sadie, please, yes, I need a break from them. Nancy slid the phone away with a quiet nod. She knew exactly what Sadie meant. When she returned to the table, Leo squinted at her thoughtfully. Nancy, he said, you look 20 years younger. The others murmured in agreement. She didn't deny it, she felt it. Lighter bones, clearer thoughts, a spine no longer curled around apologies she never should have made. By the time the evening wound down, guests had taken leftovers, hugs lingered at the door, and the candles had burned low. The villa felt full even after everyone left. Nancy stacked plates in the sink, humming softly to herself. She was reaching for the last wine glass when her phone buzzed again, this time louder, sharper. Another message. Not Sadie. Not Marla. Not a friend. Officer Grady. Ms. Rowlands, this is urgent. Claire filed a welfare complaint on your behalf. We need to verify your safety immediately. Nancy's hand went still around the stem of the glass. Claire wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The welfare check Claire filed fizzled out faster than she expected. Officer Grady had come by the next morning, clipboard in hand, eyes already apologetic. One look at Nancy, dressed, steady, alert, living in a clean, well-organized villa, was enough. I'm so sorry, he'd said, after confirming she was safe and fully competent. We get false filings sometimes. Nancy thanked him politely and closed the door behind him. She didn't waste anger on Claire's theatrics. A person drowning in their own narrative often splashes wildly. The real storm arrived the following week. Carmen's office felt warmer than usual, sun slipping through the blinds in thin golden stripes. She gestured Nancy inside with the calm of someone who already knew how the day would unfold. She filed a petition, Carmen said, sliding a thin folder across the table. She's trying to reverse the estate changes. Nancy allowed herself one slow breath. Of course she did. Of course, Carmen echoed, but with a hint of amusement. The problem for her is we documented everything. She opened the folder, and I mean everything. Inside were neatly printed logs. Claire's late-night attempts to access the savings account. Email requests for financial control. Screenshots Sadie had sent Nancy of the meltdown. The voicemail Claire left Officer Grady. The original timestamp note Nancy entered after the uptown dinner. Carmen lifted a thumb drive. I also included recordings you took over the years, the ones you forgot you even had. They're legal and devastating. Nancy blinked, she had forgotten. Claire always said, "You misheard, or you took it wrong, or you're too sensitive." But Nancy had documented it all quietly, methodically, the way an accountant protects herself from audits she knows will come. Carmen tapped the stack. "This is airtight." Later that afternoon, in a rented conference room downtown, Claire's attorney skimmed the evidence with increasing discomfort. He wasn't an unkind man, just the type paid to clean up selective truths, but the paperwork was thorough enough to strip illusions bare. "Mrs. Rowlands," he finally said, turning toward Claire, "there is no viable path to challenge this. Any attempt will trigger the no contest clause." Claire's mouth hung open. She doesn't, this can't be right." "It is," he said, sliding the papers back toward her. "In fact, I'm withdrawing from representation. This is unwinnable." Claire looked like someone had pulled a rug out from under her spine. Nancy didn't gloat, she didn't smile, she didn't even look at Claire. She simply placed her hands on her lap and waited for the attorney to leave the room. When the door closed, Claire spun toward her, eyes glassy with panic. "You're ruining this family," she hissed. Nancy finally met her gaze. "No," she said quietly, "I'm refusing to be ruined by it." Claire faltered, her anger had nowhere to land. Nancy stood and left the conference room without another word. That night, a new email arrived. Not from Claire, not from any attorney, from Jason. Subject, "I didn't know she said that." Nancy opened it slowly. "Mom, I didn't know she said those things at dinner. I didn't know she tried to access your accounts. I didn't know she told the officer you were unstable. I'm sorry, I just didn't want conflict." Nancy stared at the screen, her chest tightening, not with grief but with clarity sharper than steel. She typed back, "Jason, you heard it. You just chose comfort." She hit send without hesitation. 5 minutes later, another notification. "Sadie, thank you for not disappearing like they hoped. Some people break when treated like you were. You didn't. You got louder without yelling." Nancy's eyes softened. She wrote back, "Sweetheart, I'm not going anywhere." She set down her phone, feeling a peace she hadn't known was possible. But before she could stand, another email pinged, this time from Carmen. "Urgent, need to talk tonight." Claire escalated again, and this time she didn't act alone. Nancy's breath stilled. Claire with backup was a different equation entirely. And the numbers were shifting. The night Carmen emailed her, Nancy didn't sleep much, not out of fear, out of certainty. Claire escalating meant one thing: she had finally realized she no longer had a grip on Nancy's life. When controlling people lose grip, they thrash. Carmen warned her. Marla predicted it. Nancy had lived through it. But she wasn't going backward. She was going bigger. 2 mornings later, Nancy sat in the quiet meeting room of the Charlotte Women in Finance Foundation, a nonprofit she'd donated to quietly for years. Now she was sitting across from its director, a warm-eyed woman named Evelyn with a calm enthusiasm Nancy found grounding. "You're sure about this?" Evelyn asked gently. "It's a significant investment." Nancy folded her hands. "I am, completely." Evelyn nodded and opened the folder in front of her. At the top, the Rowlands Scholarship for GIRLS in Finance. Nancy felt her throat tighten, not with sadness but with long-delayed purpose. 40 years in accounting had shown her how many young women were discouraged early, dismissed quietly, pushed out subtly. She remembered the doors she had to pry open alone. She remembered the way Claire sneered at her profession like numbers beneath her were invisible. Nancy didn't want apologies. She wanted access for someone who needed it. And Evelyn continued, sliding a signature line toward her. "You requested that the inaugural recipient be a student of your choosing." "Yes," Nancy said slowly, "a girl who sees more than she's given credit for." Evelyn smiled knowingly. "Sadie Rowlands." Nancy's heart warmed. She earned it. She signed the final page. The ink barely dried before Evelyn said, "Congratulations, Ms. Rowlands. This is going to change lives." Major Twist 2 had unfolded quietly. No drama, no outburst, no audience. Just Nancy building something Claire couldn't corrupt. And in just 3 weeks, the ripple began. The Charlotte Observer featured the scholarship in its Sunday edition, a full-color spread with Nancy's portrait beside the headline. 70-year-old accountant creates fund for GIRLS in finance. She nearly dropped her tea when she saw it, not because she was surprised Evelyn had requested permission, but because the article named the first recipient. Sadie Rowlands, 14, awarded inaugural scholarship. Sadie didn't tell her beforehand. She showed up at Nancy's villa with the paper in her hands, eyes bright, cheeks warm. "They interviewed me," she said breathlessly. I told them you're the reason I'm not afraid of math. Nancy hugged her tightly, breath catching as if the years had folded neatly into this single moment. Claire, however, reacted like someone had swallowed her oxygen supply. Sadie sent a screenshot an hour later, Claire pacing the kitchen, the newspaper sprawled across the counter. Jason stood behind her, stiff, unsure where to look. The caption Sadie wrote beneath it. She's furious, I mean wild. Another image followed, Claire stabbing her finger at the headline, voice raised, demanding answers from no one in particular. Nancy watched the video twice, not with pleasure but with a strange sense of release. Claire had built her world on perception. Nancy had built something on impact. They were never the same game. 2 days later, a package arrived at Nancy's villa wrapped in glossy silver paper. Inside was a small engraved pen, expensive, delicate, unmistakably Jason's attempt to make peace. Nancy stared at it for a long moment before placing it back into the box, resealing the paper and writing across the front in steady ink. Return to sender. She left it in the villa's outgoing mail bin without hesitation. She wasn't cruel. She was done. Within a month, her mailbox was full daily, letters from young girls across North Carolina thanking her for creating a scholarship that made them feel seen. Some envelopes were messy and glittered with stickers. Others were typed neatly and signed with careful loops. Every single one carried hope. Marla stopped by one afternoon and found Nancy knee-deep in envelopes, smiling like someone who had reclaimed the missing half of her life. My God, Marla murmured, lifting a handful, you're finally using your story for power. Nancy looked up, eyes bright. It was never about them, she said. It was about who I could help once I stopped apologizing. Marla tapped one envelope with a soft smirk. Still, I woe. Didn't mind being a fly on Claire's wall. Nancy laughed light-free. But the laughter faded when her phone buzzed with a new alert. A message from Carmen. Nancy, call me. Claire just filed something new, and this one involves Sadie. Nancy's smile vanished. The air shifted, and a new battle began. Carmen's warning about Claire involving Sadie lit a fuse inside Nancy, but not the explosive kind. It was the calm, surgical clarity of a woman who understood exactly what she could and couldn't be pulled into. The matter was handled swiftly. Carmen fired back a legal response so airtight it left no oxygen for drama. Claire's attempt fizzled before it even reached a judge. But Nancy knew something else. If Claire couldn't control her, she would try to control her narrative. So Nancy chose to write her own. The afternoon of the Women's Finance Summit arrived washed in brisk December sunlight, Charlotte's skyline glinting like polished steel as hundreds of women streamed into the convention center. Posters lined the corridor. Keynote speaker, Nancy Rollins, taking your power back at any age. Nancy adjusted the pearl earrings she had worn decades earlier, back when she was an accountant fighting for fair pay in rooms full of men who thought her quiet voice meant she couldn't count past 10. Today, that same quiet voice was being amplified through a stage-sized sound system. The backstage area buzzed with event staff, microphones, and the soft, giddy chaos of last-minute adjustments. Nancy waited with her notecards in hand, but she didn't need them. The speech wasn't a performance. It was lived. Ms. Rollins, the coordinator whispered, smiling, you're up in 30 seconds. Nancy stepped toward the curtains, heart steady, posture tall. When the lights hit her, the room shifted. Rows upon rows of women, students, retirees, single mothers, new business owners, looked up like they were ready to breathe in each word. And in the very front row, hands clasped tightly in her lap, sat Sadie. Her eyes glowed with pride bright enough to cut through the stage lights. Nancy began. Her voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. I spent years believing that endurance was loyalty, she said. That silence was kindness, that sacrificing myself kept the peace. The room stilled. But age teaches you something youth doesn't. You start to recognize the difference between giving and being drained, between helping and being used, between being invited and being tolerated. A few murmurs rippled through the audience, soft agreements, quiet encouragement. Nancy continued, steady as an accountant balancing ledgers with absolute certainty. When someone treats you like a burden, she said, that's not your reflection, it's theirs, and you are allowed to leave any table where you are spoken to like you're lucky to be there. Sadie wiped her cheek discreetly. Nancy told them about rebuilding her estate, reclaiming her finances, protecting her autonomy. Not with venom, not with gossip, just facts shared with the calm dignity she had earned inch by inch. When they told me not to stay long, she said, I realized something. They were right. I didn't stay long, I stayed where I mattered instead. Applause erupted, not a polite ripple but a wave that rolled from the front row to the back. Women rose from their seats. Some clapped, some cheered, some cried quietly behind their programs. Nancy stepped away from the podium, a soft smile curving her lips as she descended the stairs. Sadie met her halfway, throwing her arms around her waist in an embrace that was both tender and fierce. "That was incredible," she whispered, voice choked with pride. Nancy stroked her granddaughter's hair. "You gave me the reason." But victory never stayed quiet for long. By the time Nancy reached the reception area backstage, her phone vibrated. Marla leaned over her shoulder as she unlocked it. A new post from Claire. A single sentence dripping with venom. "Even snakes wear pearls." And beneath it, nothing, not a single comment. Because Claire had turned off replies after years of backlash, she pretended not to understand. Nancy locked her phone, exhaling softly. "She's shouting into an empty room," she murmured. Marla snorted. "Let her echo, you're in an auditorium." Nancy's smile deepened, but as she turned the corner toward the exit, a young volunteer hurried up to her, clutching a clipboard. "Ms. Rowlands, there's someone waiting for you outside. They said it's urgent." Nancy froze. "Who?" The volunteer hesitated. "They didn't give a name, but they insisted you'd want to see them." Nancy's pulse shifted, steady but alert. Whoever stood outside wasn't waiting with applause. They were waiting with intent. The person waiting outside the convention center was Claire, or Jason, or anyone Nancy had braced for. It was a reporter. A young woman with a notebook tucked under her arm and an eager, respectful expression. "Ms. Rowlands," she said breathlessly, "your speech. People are talking about it. Would you be open to an interview next week?" Nancy blinked in surprise, then smiled. "Of course." By that evening, the article was already circulating online, praise pouring into her inbox in waves she hadn't expected. Women quoted her lines, college students shared clips, financial advisors asked her to speak again in the spring. Nancy fell asleep that night with a sense of momentum, like her life had finally clicked into alignment. But across town, someone else was watching it all burn. Claire's finances began crumbling like a badly built tower. First, the credit card she used for her weekly brunch declined. Then the boutique she favored for holiday outfits rejected a purchase outright. Claire made a scene, loud enough that one of Sadie's classmates' mothers texted Sadie a blurry photo of her mother arguing with the cashier. Sadie forwarded it to Nancy with a caption, "Meltdown level Olympic." Nancy only shook her head. Chaos always looks loudest when it finally echoes back. 2 days later, Jason called with a voice scraped thin. "Mom," he said, hesitant, "the bank denied my small business loan. They said the consigne fell through." Nancy stepped onto her balcony, letting the cold winter air settle around her. "I withdrew it," she said simply. There was a stunned pause. "Why?" "You needed to stand on your own feet," Nancy replied. "Not mine, not ever again." Jason didn't argue, just let out a quiet, defeated breath before hanging up. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt aligned. Later that week, Sadie texted again. "Guess what? I started budgeting, like you taught me." Nancy smiled, opening her bedside drawer. Inside was a small, vintage calculator she'd used for years, its buttons slightly worn, its display still sharp. She wrapped it in tissue paper, placed it inside a padded envelope, and wrote a note in looping, steady handwriting. "Keep score, but only for yourself. Grandma." She mailed it the next morning. A few days later, Marla visited with a bag of groceries and a bottle of wine. They cooked together something warm and simple and sat at Nancy's small dining table while sleet ticked against the window. Marla poured a glass, studying her friend over the rim. "You've changed," she said, "in a good way, but tell me," she paused, raising one brow, "is it enough yet?" Nancy set down her fork. "It's not revenge," she said softly, "it's realignment." The phrase settled between them, true and unshakable. Marla leaned back, satisfied. "Good, because they're unraveling, you know." "I know," Nancy murmured, "but that's their balance sheet, not mine." The first knock came 3 days before Christmas. Nancy was reading on the couch when the sharp tapping echoed through the villa. 3 fast knocks, no hesitation, no courtesy pause, an entitled rhythm she recognized instantly. "Claire." Nancy didn't move. More knocking, louder this time. "Nancy," Claire's voice cracked through the door, brittle, forced. "We need to talk. Something's wrong with Sadie and Jason's losing sleep and—" Nancy took a sip of her tea. Through the window, she watched the wind push the branches of the pines, the world outside moving at its own steady pace. "Nancy." A fist hit the door again. She stood not to answer but to switch on the porch light. The sudden illumination washed over Claire's startled face, exhausted, tense, makeup smudged, hair unpracticed. Nancy didn't open the door. She simply spoke through it, calm and unwavering. "This door isn't for unannounced visits." A stunned silence followed. "Nancy, please, just 2 minutes." "No," Nancy said gently, "what you want isn't here." She turned and walked back to her armchair, Claire's muffled voice fading like static she no longer tuned into. Eventually, footsteps crunched down the walkway. A car engine sputtered on, then silence reclaimed the night. Nancy placed her book in her lap, letting the quiet settle again. But just as she reached for her tea, her phone buzzed on the end table. A message from Sadie. Short, breathless. Not her usual tone. "Grandma, something happened. I need you now." Nancy sat upright, heart tightening. The door she wouldn't open for Claire. She would sprint through for Sadie. Nancy grabbed her coat the moment she saw Sadie's message, but within minutes a second text arrived, this one from Sadie again. "I'm okay, not hurt, I just need space for a minute, I'll explain soon." Nancy exhaled slowly, hand pressed to the edge of the counter. The urgency in the first message had cut like a wire. The second softened it, but not enough for her to ignore the tension threading her granddaughter's words. She typed back, "My door's open whenever you need it." 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Then nothing. Nancy set her phone down beside her tea, aware of the way silence stretched when you were waiting for someone you loved to breathe on their own terms. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the windows in cold, restless strokes. The pines swayed like tall shadows shifting against the gray sky. Then came the knock. A violent, frantic pounding, 3 hits followed by another harder. Nancy didn't have to stand to know the cadence. "Claire." Again. She didn't move. More pounding. Then the unmistakable pitch of Claire performing distress. "Nancy," her voice wavered, too exaggerated, too shaky. "Please, open the door, please, I'm begging you, something's wrong with Sadie." Nancy lifted her tea, the steam warming her palm. She took a sip and watched a single pine branch bend, then spring back upright. Nature had a way of snapping back from pressure. People didn't always learn that skill. She didn't rise. Outside, Claire's voice cracked in faux hysteria. "Nancy, I know you're in there, I saw your car, we have to talk. Jason is losing it, Sadie is shutting us out, and this is your fault." Nancy set her tea down with measured calm. "Her fault? Of course." Responsibility was always assigned to the person who refused to carry everyone else's consequences. She stood only when the banging hit the doorframe in a bruising rhythm. Instead of unlocking anything, she walked to the porch light switch again, flipping it on. Claire flinched under the sudden brightness, mascara streaked, coat half-zipped, hair wind-tossed. Her eyes were glassy, but not from tears, from panic. The panic of someone watching their leverage disintegrate grain by grain. Nancy spoke through the door, tone level. "You may not use Sadie as an entry point." "Nancy, she won't talk to us, she won't answer. What did you say to her?" Claire's voice trembled, the performance slipping into real desperation. "What I said," Nancy replied, "was that she can come to me if she needs safety, not excuses." Claire sucked in a breath. "Th. It sounded like it hurt. This has gone too far, Jason is terrified." Nancy didn't soften. She didn't lean closer. She simply responded with the truth Claire had spent years pretending didn't exist. "It went too far," Nancy said quietly when he stayed silent. Silence followed, a stunned hollow lapse where even Claire seemed unsure how to respond. Then footsteps retreated. A car door slammed. Tires hissed across wet pavement. The villa fell still again. Nancy returned to her chair, lifting her tea with hands that didn't shake. Her phone buzzed softly. "Jason, this has gone too far." She typed without hesitation. "It went too far when you let her speak to me that way." 3 dots appeared. Vanished. Didn't return. Minutes later, another message lit her screen. "Sadie, they're losing friends, you're gaining peace." Nancy smiled, small, grateful, warmed by the honesty Sadie had learned to wield like a shield. She typed back a short reply, then set the phone aside. For the first time in years, she walked to the corner of the living room where her upright piano sat beneath a shawl. She hadn't touched it since her husband died. Music had felt too tender, too vulnerable. But tonight, she lifted the cover. The keys were cool under her fingers. The first soft chord eased from the instrument like breath returning to a lung that had been empty too long. Another chord followed, then a melody halting at first, then smooth. The room seemed to shift with it, the shadows pulling back, the tension dissolving like sugar in warm water. Nancy played until her shoulders relaxed, until her chest loosened, until her home felt like a sanctuary again. She was winding down a gentle phrase when her phone buzzed on the sofa. She kept playing. Another buzz. Then another, sharper this time, more urgent. She stopped, crossed the room, picked up the phone. A new message. Not from Sadie. Not from Jason. Not even from Carmen's. It was from a number she didn't recognize. And the preview froze her breath. Ms. Rowlands, this concerns Sadie. Please call immediately. Nancy called the number immediately, pulse steady but sharpened. A young voice answered, Sadie's guidance counselor, speaking quickly, gently, the way professionals did when they were trying not to alarm a family. Sadie came to see me this morning, she said. She was overwhelmed. She asked if she could list you as her emergency contact going forward. I told her she could. She said she'll explain everything to you herself. Nancy pressed a hand to her sternum, relief washing in slow warmth. Thank you, she whispered. No danger. Just truth seeking a safe place. When the call ended, she sat for a long moment in her quiet villa, fingers still on the phone screen. The fear Claire had tried to weaponize twisted into something useless and small. Sadie chose her. That mattered more than whatever storm Claire was spinning next. The storm arrived by email the following afternoon. Nancy was spreading fresh sheets across her bed when her laptop chimed. It was Carmen, subject line in bold. You're going to love this. Nancy opened the attachment. A court notice, another filing. Claire had lodged a formal accusation claiming Nancy was exerting undue influence over Sadie and manipulating family dynamics for financial gain. Nancy blinked once. Then again. It was so absurd she had to reread it to confirm Claire had truly put her name on something so wildly backwards. Moments later, Carmen called, already laughing. This won't last 10 minutes. Nancy sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing a crease from the sheet. She really filed this. Oh, she did, Carmen said, still amused, and she attached screenshots, edited ones badly. Nancy let out a slow breath. I see. Don't worry, Carmen added. The judge will dismiss this before lunchtime. You don't even need to attend. Honestly, it's almost cute in a self-destructive way. Nancy huffed a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but wasn't far from one. Cute isn't the word I'd use. The hearing happened the next morning. Nancy didn't drive downtown. She didn't sit in the gallery. She didn't even change out of her soft gray cardigan. She simply brewed tea, stepped onto the balcony, and let the winter sun warm her face. At 11:14 a.m., Carmen texted. Dismissed, judge called it a waste of the court's time. 1 minute later. And wait, oh, this is beautiful. He fined Claire for submitting false claims. Nancy stared at the message, the steam from her teacup curling upward like a ribbon. There was no triumph. Just confirmation. Carmen called a moment later, voice bright with the thrill of justice. In all my years, she said, I've rarely seen a judge shut something down that fast. I'm glad it's over, Nancy replied simply. Oh, it's over, Carmen said. She'll get the fine notice this afternoon. Nancy thanked her and ended the call. Then she pulled open her desk drawer, found a blank card, just white cardstock, no design, no message, and rot. A single word across the inside in small, meticulous handwriting. Noted. She slid it into an envelope, addressed it to Claire's house, and walked it to the villa's outgoing mail slot with the same composure she'd once used during year-end audits. By evening, her phone buzzed with a new message from Sadie. A photo first, Sadie grinning under fairy lights outside her school, cheeks pink from the cold. Then the text. You made her feel powerless without raising a hand. Nancy sat down slowly, the message settling into her chest like warm weight. She wrote back. I wasn't trying to make her feel anything. I was protecting myself, and you. 3 dots appeared. Paused. Reappeared. Grandma, I need to tell you something important tomorrow. Please don't worry, it's good, I promise. Nancy smiled softly, though her pulse stirred with curiosity. Before she could type a reply, her villa's landline rang, rare, unexpected. She crossed the room and lifted the receiver. A man's voice spoke, calm, professional, familiar. Ms. Rowlands, this is Dr. Keaton from Charlotte General. I believe you know Sadie Rowlands. Nancy's spine went cold. Yes, she breathed. Is she all right? She's safe, he said quickly, but she asked us to call you first. Nancy gripped the receiver tighter, breath suspended. Why? She whispered. The doctor exhaled. Because she doesn't want her parents involved. And the world shifted again, quietly but irrevocably. Dr. Keaton's reassurance steadied her. Sadie was safe. She wanted Nancy, not Claire, not Jason. That truth alone softened something inside Nancy that had been clenched for decades. By morning, Sadie texted again. I'm okay, I just wanted someone to call who actually listens. I'll explain soon. Nancy didn't press, she wrote back. Take your time, I'm here. And then quietly, without announcement, the year shifted. The retirement villa near the lake became Nancy's full-time home by early spring. The move wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no boxes thrown together in panic, just deliberate choices stacked one by one like careful entries in a ledger. The villa was warm, sunlit, framed in tall windows overlooking rippling blue water. Ducks waddled across the walking paths in the mornings. Neighbors waved. No one asked her to hurry. She unpacked slowly over the first week, giving each item a small ceremony it had never received in Claire's house. There was the floral china Claire once mocked as grandmotherly. The crocheted throw Jason said clashed with modern decor. The wooden clock she brought from her childhood home, dismissed by Claire as clutter. A jar of seashells from the trip she took with her late husband. The framed picture of Sadie at age 6, missing her 2 front teeth, laughing so hard her eyes disappeared. Nancy placed each piece where she pleased. For the first time in years, her home looked like her life, not someone else's curated showroom. By the second week, she hosted her first game night. Neighbors piled in with casseroles and card decks. Marla arrived wearing a scarf the color of blackberry jam and carrying a tray of cookies shaped like dollar signs. Theme appropriate, she winked. Laughter filled the villa until late evening. Someone spilled juice on the rug, someone dropped a bowl, no one apologized excessively. It felt human. Nancy realized, midway through a particularly intense round of rummikub, that she wasn't counting minutes or measuring her tone or coaching herself not to take up space. She simply belonged. Sundays became brunch days. Thursdays, piano afternoons. She played old jazz standards while neighbors sipped tea and sighed in appreciation. Her hands grew steadier, her posture straighter, her laugh looser. People came not because they pitied her, but because they liked her. A novelty Claire might never understand. When spring break arrived, Sadie showed up at the villa door with a duffel bag, a sketchbook, and a tired but hopeful smile. Can I stay a while? She asked. Nancy stepped aside. 2 weeks, 2 months, you choose the number. Sadie stayed the full 2 weeks. She slept late, painted by the lake, ate breakfast on the balcony wrapped in one of Nancy's shawls. They watched old movies, baked blueberry muffins, and walked the shoreline whispering about college plans, friendships, and the kind of adulthood Sadie hoped to build once she was free to choose it. One night, Sadie curled up on the couch, head in Nancy's lap, and whispered, I feel normal here. Nancy stroked her hair gently. That's because normal isn't supposed to hurt. The girl nodded, eyes misty but steady. A week after Sadie returned home, a card arrived in Nancy's mailbox. Cream envelope, elegant handwriting. From Carmen. Inside, one line. Cleanest closure I've ever filed. Nancy smiled, small, victorious, deeply satisfied. It wasn't revenge. It was removal. A cleansing. Later that evening, Marla appeared with a chilled bottle of champagne and 2 mismatched glasses. She popped the cork, ignoring the spray across the counter. To women who don't beg, Marla declared. Nancy clinked her glass against hers, to women who outgrow their cages. They drank, laughed, and watched the sun dip below the lake, painting the water in ribbons of gold. Peace looked like possibility. But peace never meant nothing was coming. Just as Nancy rinsed the glasses in the sink, her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown sender. Not robotic. Not spam. Human. Intentional. She wiped her hands, opened it, and frowned. A single sentence stared back at her. Nancy, you should know, Claire is planning something, and this time she isn't hiding it. Nancy's fingers tightened around the counter. The lake outside darkened. The villa fell quiet. And the year she started fresh, prepared to shift again, whether Claire liked it or not. The anonymous warning about Claire's new plan never materialized into anything dangerous. Carmen traced it back easily, just another desperate attempt by Claire to stir panic, fishing for relevance she no longer owned. The courts ignored her, the community ignored her, and eventually even Jason grew too exhausted to play interpreter. Life, on the other hand, did what Claire never expected. It kept moving without her. Spring melted into early summer when Sadie showed up at Nancy's villa, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes bright with something braver than before. "Grandma," she said softly, stepping inside, "can I ask you something weird?" Nancy set aside her knitting. "Of course." Sadie hesitated, then pulled a slim notebook from her bag, Nancy's old journal, the one she'd kept for years with small, careful handwriting filling each page. Sadie held it like something sacred. "I found it in the piano bench," she said. "I wasn't snooping, I promise. I just opened it without thinking, and once I started reading, I couldn't stop." Nancy's breath caught, not in fear but in tenderness. Sadie stepped closer, her voice trembling. "You wrote everything," she whispered. "The way they spoke to you, the way you were treated, the way you kept trying anyway. I didn't know it was that bad. I didn't know you went through all of that alone." Tears clung to her lashes. "You taught me everything," she said, "not by lecturing, by surviving." Nancy rose slowly and pulled Sadie into her arms. The girl folded against her, shaking. Nancy smoothed her hair, whispering into the crown of her head. "Don't pity people who choose cruelty. Save your compassion for those who earn it." Sadie nodded against her shoulder, her breath hitching but steadier. By midsummer, the news broke quietly around Charlotte. Jason and Claire had filed for bankruptcy. No formal announcement, no phone call, no forwarded letter meant to guilt her. Nancy only found out because Sadie, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, snapped a picture of the mailed notice her parents tried to hide under a pile of expired coupons. "They pretended it was junk mail," Sadie wrote. "I don't think they even realize I know." Nancy stared at the photo, her emotions a quiet, settled tide. No triumph, no relish, just confirmation choices had outcomes. Silence had consequences, and enabling someone's cruelty never protected them from themselves. She placed her phone face down and returned to her tea, the lake outside shimmering beneath a soft morning breeze. Autumn arrived with golden leaves and new invitations. Nancy's scholarship, the Rollins Fund, had grown faster than the board projected. After the article, donations poured in from women across the state, each with a story, each wanting to lift the next girl a little higher. By October, Carmen sent another envelope from her office. Inside was a simple typed note. "Your foundation now serves 3 states. Congratulations." Nancy set the letter on her mantle and let pride warm her gently from the inside. A week later, a ceremony was held for the newest scholarship recipients, girls in bright dresses, clutching folders of dreams larger than their hands. Nancy attended quietly, sitting in the front row. When her name was called, a tiny girl no older than 11 stepped forward from the lineup. She had big glasses, a shy smile, and a spark of confidence fighting through her nerves. She approached Nancy with a trembling breath and whispered, barely audible, "Thank you. I want to be an accountant too." Nancy knelt so they were eye level. "You'll be better than I ever was," she said softly. "Your future won't be built on pity." The girl smiled, small but real, the kind that hinted at entire futures rearranging themselves. Nancy straightened and watched the room swell with applause, not for her, but for the next generation she had finally cleared a path for. That night back at the villa, she lit a candle, opened the window to let in the cool November air, and sat at her writing desk. She opened a fresh journal, wrote a single line at the top. Her story had always been measured in whispers, numbers balanced, choices made quietly, boundaries drawn without spectacle, but the ending deserved its full sentence. Her hand didn't shake. She wrote, "My daughter-in-law said we only invited you out of pity, so don't stay long." I smiled and made sure her invitation would never come again. And for the first time in decades, Nancy closed the book on a life she had rewritten in her own ink.